So we wanted to make sure we put our faces on the slide so you have trouble distinguishing between us. Henri's the taller one, obviously. When we first submitted a request to Pivotal to present here at SpringOne, we were pretty bold and we asked for a keynote, and they said no. And so we said, well, what if we wear a hoodie? And they said no. And then we said, well, what about a hoodie and maybe a T-shirt, like an ironic technology T-shirt for an hour? And again, they said no. So they ended up giving us a 30-minute time slot at 5 o'clock. And we agreed to put stickers on our computers. So I put a .NET sticker on my computer. So we wanted to give you guys a little bit of insight into some of the stuff that Schwab is doing, particularly as it relates to modernization and our migration to cloud. Some of the lessons that we have learned, some of the approaches that we have been taking to hopefully give you some insight as you go through this journey. I'm sure a lot of you are probably already going through a similar journey, but maybe we can provide a little bit more insight into our approach and the tactics that we're taking.
So before we start, we want to kind of get a sense, so you got to get a sense of who Charles Schwab is. You guys have probably heard of our name. But we started off with a humble beginning in about 1975, and with a basic premise to say it's all about the client. And part of that, we take that very seriously, passionately, that everything we do, we kind of look through the client's eyes and see what the experiences are. Now, that's a critical point because we then see what the clients are seeing. We're delivering the right capabilities, right experiences for our clients. Now, because of that and that simple vision, we've been able to grow as an organization. We're currently one of the largest financial investment firms, publicly traded. And as you can see, we have up to $3.2 trillion in assets that we manage for our clients. So you can see it's very important for us to continue to focus on that. So our migration and cloud-native approach views it in the same way as well. So to put it in context of the size of the organization, we really split it down into three main parts. One is the investment services side of the house. So those are kind of your classical brokerage side. We also have the retirement services side. So think about your 401ks. And finally, also the advisor services side of the house. And that's a large portfolio there as well. But whatever we do, we continue to focus back on how the client sees things. So what we're going to go through will demonstrate to you as well that we constantly focus on that. We want to continue to have the client have the best experience while we go through this. So with this, why don't we get started?
So let's take a look at the technology. We're not going to go into details, but as with any large organization, you can imagine Schwab has and continues to explore technology. So a 40-year-old company had grew up on legacy systems. So you can imagine that this large ecosystem of both, I would say, distributed and legacy mainframe systems exists today. So the problem that we have is how do we go about trying to decompose this and modernize it while we're not impacting the client? And that's the important piece, as Henri mentioned, is that we need to look at this through the client's eyes, but we don't want to impact them. So we have this enormous ecosystems. You name it, we probably have used it or use it. Distributed solutions, mainframe solutions, et cetera.
So let's play a game. So this is the part that gets interactive. So I'm glad that all of you guys showed up. So we kind of said it during the keynote already, which we didn't get, by the way. We're not sore about this by any means. But as part of the keynote, one of the great sessions was also, let's do a gameplay. And it plays very well with what we're going to be talking about. So show of hands, what is this? Okay, football field, right? So let's use it as our gameplay. So let's go through this, and we'll use this as an analogy. So John and I tend to use a lot of analogies, especially what we do in the day-to-day world. So this will be very applicable. So let's go through it. John?
What is this? Anybody? A play. Why is a play important? Why do football teams use plays? Plan of attack? Perfect.
Same page.
Okay.
Okay. So, great. We're going to play. Do they just play one play? So what is this? Playbook. Oh, you guys, nobody got paid for this? This is Brenda. Fantastic. This is a playbook. It consists of a couple of different plays. Great. I got a couple of different plays that I can play. Now what?
So do you think offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators get paid just to use a set number of plays in a fixed order? No, they really don't. So they need to understand when to use a given play at a certain time in order to move their team down the field and achieve an objective. So they have a playbook, but the art and the science is really when to use that play appropriately.
So great. So we got a playbook. Doesn't mean you become a great team, right? Now, we live in Denver, so Broncos are not doing that good. So we're helping them. We're helping them, serious. So we got the playbook, but when we look at the monolith, how do you use what part of the play? What is good? Keep in mind, we need to have things keep on running for the clients, but which one do we pick, right? We need some guidance around this. So let's explore that a little bit more.
So what's the solution? Well, pretty simply, you could just stop using X's and O's and start using hexagons. Wouldn't that work? No.
Yep.
So you can move down the field this way. Basically, you need a way to decompose your application, continue to use that analogy, to move it down the field in order to achieve what your end state is.
So great. So we've appeased all the project managers, right? Take the big hexagon, move it down the field, declare victory, right? Well, there's a little bit more to it. So we follow a basic three-step approach. We first make an assessment, look what we can use, and then apply them. So it's like basic archaeology, right? Is you kind of need to know where you're at before you start digging, and then you start implementing these things. So with that, why don't we dive into a little bit more detail so you get a better appreciation of how we go about doing this.
So as we said before, it is almost like an archaeology effort in some cases, especially for a company that's 40 years old. We often say to teams, you need to understand where you are before you know where you're going. And so this is an important step in our process and in our approach. So it's really more of an assessment of the application and the infrastructure and what the application ecosystem looks like. And so you can see there's some various things that we want teams to consider when they're looking to determine what their current state is. So going into what are all the use cases that this application supports, some of the application, its ecosystem, meaning its context, what are the components associated with it, and then right away we always get the question of, well, why are you doing all of this effort and not being more agile? And let me be clear that we're not saying that you shouldn't be agile even in this archaeological approach and understanding what the architecture looks like, but you need to understand, again, exactly where you are. And if you can't do that, again, you don't know where you're gonna go.
Right. So with that, during the conference, you guys already hear, like, install some Spring Cloud services, right? Full 12-factor Greenfield approach to your problem, right? Everybody has this problem, right? We can start just like Twitter, no big deal. Well, wait a minute. We 40-year-old company. We have a lot of systems. How do you go from A to B? Well, part of that evaluation, you should ask yourself the question, like, where am I at on the spectrum, right? Because not one solution fits all problems. You want to look at the fact of, on one side, am I just replacing the technology? And the other side, am I going full cloud native, right? Now, do you think for everything you need to go full cloud native? Probably not, right? There's a lot of things in there that you're somewhere on the spectrum. To help determine and ascertain that decision, you got to make some trade-offs in certain areas. So we've copyrighted this diagram. And
we haven't.
We didn't, sorry. But it's an illustration to help gauge you where you're at with your application to determine how far do you go and how much do you really need to do. And that's key when we start talking about next is the implementation pieces.
So once you've understood really what the rules of the field are, meaning that you would never see, as an example, you'd never see a receiver come off the field, go out of bounds, and score a touchdown from out of bounds. So you need to understand really what the rules of the game are. You need to watch game film, and what I mean by that, again, is just determining from a strategy perspective, what is your strategy, and what's going to tell you what is modern. So for example, if you haven't evaluated cloud, and cloud is not a part of your strategy, then that's not going to help you. But if you say it's a combination, maybe hybrid cloud, you understand what modern is to you and your applications. The other thing is understanding patterns. What patterns or plays can I follow in order to help us achieve? And this is more of the how. So we always talk about things in terms of what is modern, but then also how to achieve a modern state. So the plays, the playbooks, the patterns that we talk to teams about are really, how do I get there?
So we kind of know the how, we know some of the patterns. But if I just tell a team, like the Denver Broncos, and just go ahead and do these, well, they need some structure in the playbook. So we're being pretty prescriptive in our playbooks to help describe what patterns are there and give it some level of organization as well. And that organization allows us to put things in context as well. Like, great, I've got a strangulation pattern. Do I use it all the time? Probably not. There's only certain cases you do it. So we actually organize it so that it becomes very applicable to which patterns to use when. And also which patterns are correlated to each other that you can combine together as well, making it for a more conducive playbook.
So I know, how does it all fit together? And so you understand the rules, you understand what modern is, you know how to get there, and now you need to implement it. And this is really, again, where art and science kind of merge, and I call it this negative space between what is modern versus how to get there. And so again, you really need to understand, as you're going down this journey, when to use certain plays at the right time. In certain instances, let's say on a third down, you may want to call a go route versus just trying to run it for short yardage. So again, this is where art and science comes together, and this is where offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators get paid the big bucks.
So great, so now you have the playbook. You can now say, we've got a hexagon as well. And now you can take the different pieces in the hexagon and deliberately go through it and select what patterns of the playbook you're applying. So now you can have a game. You guys ready to play? All right. So having said all this, we've kind of gone through this journey. We are putting the playbooks together, and teams are leveraging those as well. So there's already a couple of things we want to share with you guys. What have we learned as part of this journey? So with that, let's kind of walk through some of the lessons learned from this process.
So one thing is being very clear on what is the definition of done. We state that up front, that every team needs to understand when they modernize, how are you defining done? And then as a consideration at the end of it on the execution, you need to make sure that done is done. And what I mean by that is, let's take an example of an application that's modernized. And you've gone through this process, you have new microservices, you're adhering to that architectural style, but then you still have all that legacy stuff out there. The key here is to make sure that you're retiring that as well. The other thing I'd say is make sure that you're engaging both the technology partners, other technology partners, as well as business partners up front, meaning that if you need to get buy-in or you have other projects that are coming on board where you have contention with the projects and the modernization, you need to figure out how you're going to do that in tandem and in parallel. So getting their buy-in up front is going to be important. And then the other thing really is just making sure that resources are trained. So this is one big aspect, at least within Schwab, is that making sure that the teams that are participating in this really understand it and understand the technology and the concepts that you're talking about. That's a big piece.
Yeah, so in summary, so a lot of it is like archaeology, but the beauty of architecture as well in this place is that you're not just focused on the technology side, right? You deal with the processy side, the business changes, the training. It's very all-encompassing that you have to take in mind. So with that, we kind of want to conclude. So one of the key messages we want to leave with you guys, keep it simple, organize it around these plays and how you can play the game. Another key shameless plug that we want to give you guys, we are hiring. We're definitely hiring more than some of the other financial institutions that are here during this conference. So come check us out. It's a great environment to work in. There's also a lot of Schwabies here in the audience that we're glad to kind of share what we're doing. With that, we'll be glad to kind of take some questions. Sure, question in the back.
Are there any sort of repeated pain points that you've run into as you help folks modernize or move to the cloud? Any like specific examples you can think of?
Sure. So the question is, are there any repeated patterns or learnings of problems that you run into moving to the cloud?
I would say one big thing is foundational items. So making sure that, again, as I said, that you, depending on your strategy, that certain foundational items like hosting platforms, et cetera, that you've already said are strategic, that are in place. Because if you don't have those, obviously, teams are going to struggle. And that includes both the solution and the software itself, but then also the process around that. So making sure that teams can onboard to a given platform is going to be vitally important to have that up front. Patterns is just really more, I would say, from the patterns that we've been exploring, it's more education. So explaining to teams the value in doing this, and that there may be some implementation details that vary depending on the pattern. And it's come up quite a few times. Take, for example, if we implemented a router and anti-corruption layer and use a repository interface, some teams sometimes want to do this in actual physical constructs versus logical construct, and making sure that you can distinguish between the two and when to use them, when not to. Yeah, that's kind of a key point what John is making, is that you want to make sure you're clear and deliberate on those things. Make it simpler as well. I think the other part too is a little bit of an eyes wide open with a lot of these things, is that what we typically cloud, some of the things that we're talking about with cloud native, if you're going to go from a 101 course to like a 401 course all of a sudden with implementation, you don't just do that overnight, right? You want to be deliberate. You want to make sure that people understand those concepts. I mean, it was said already before, distributed computing is hard. And if you really, I tend to enjoy that part, is that the 7 fallacies of distributed computing. Keep that in mind, right? It's not an easy CF push to a certain extent. There's a lot more other things you have to take care of as part of your architecture. Great question. Any other questions? In the back.
How does your organization handle the funding to do the modernization? Talk about projects, business partners, part of the funding budget, or did you set funds aside separately that get directly towards modernization?
Yeah, so the question is, how was the funding done for this particular effort? We made a deliberate effort of actually turning this into a large program to do modernization. Yep.
But that's not to say that we encourage teams and actually guide them to also do modernization, even with project-based stuff. So that both project-based stuff as well as this larger program are all trying to drive the ships in the same direction.
Yep. It's definitely not an all or nothing. It's a destination that everybody's moving towards. Yeah. Great question.
There was another. Yes, sir.
How did you address production support?
Yeah, that's a good question. So depending on the platform, we will and potentially do change teams. And so we're trying to remove their focus on production support items, if I understand your question correctly. So teams could adjust to be independent and have their own production support, or more centralized. It varies. Does that answer your question, or is it related to something else? No, that's good.
Yeah, there's definitely more of a notion that the teams own more of their own destination. Yeah. Question over here.
So to what degree is your playbook a living document? If it's living, how do you socialize change of the document across the development?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. So the question is that how do you, let me just call it Evergreen, the document. So the way we set the first foundational aspect of it, and I'll address the socialization aspect first. We tend to do roadshows within the firm as well, where we go around the different service centers to make sure that everybody understands what these things are, to set the foundation. With that as well, we get a lot of input from all the other individuals, so a lot of the architects in the firm, and we take that input to then enhance the patterns as well. And it's a continuous effort where we actually create a backlog around this as well. Because we have no illusions that it's one and done. It's a continuing evolving, depending on the situations, depending on the modernization that's going on as well. And when we find certain challenges, we go step back, identify what are the patterns for this, how does it is part of the play. Just like what you do with any team as well, right? You have to adjust and adapt for those things.
I think we have published the playbook to an internal wiki site or an internal share site, and the teams, it's available for them along with the implementation and usage guidelines as we showed. But then we also go and meet with teams when needed and dive in with architects to show them, make sure that they understand the pattern and the exact implementation.
Good.
There was another question over here. No, not anymore.
There's
Sorry,
a question in the back.
So did you migrate to off-premise or on-premise cloud? If you went off-premise, did you migrate database stuff off-premise as well?
And so we won't get into specifics on the cloud strategy, but it is a consideration, both public and private cloud. Today we do have an on-prem solution that we're using, a very well-known one that puts on a conference. Data is still something that's under consideration. I'd say we're pretty early in the execution on that. Data under consideration as it relates to public.
But essentially the strategy, as you can kind of see, is that the focus is to be cloud native. So regardless of where you run, it should be to a certain extent immaterial. But there's obviously some things from data synchronization, patterns associated with those as well.
Latency. Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
This speed of light thing.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
What are the guidelines for the technology stacks?
So we've set forth, so the question was, what are the guidelines on technology stacks? So I would say we are somewhat prescriptive in those, meaning that we say you can probably choose between one major one, potentially based on using Spring, or another one based on another company. And we try to leave some freedom for the developers to decide from a technology perspective exactly what they use, as long as it fits in. We kind of think of it as a road. As long as you don't go off out of your lane or off the road, we're okay. But for the most part, we remain and still stay somewhat prescriptive in that.
Yeah. You kind of notice this as well in one of our slides as well. When John says about the road, we kind of set up the guardrails, as long as you stay within the guardrails. That kind of ensures that we get to the end goal.
But when we notice teams, and this is what the definition of what is modern for us, if we notice teams not going the same direction as everyone else, we kind of bring them back in. Yes, sir.
When you're going through the modernization program, how did you keep delivering business value in those systems that were affected, or did you have them pause delivering business value until they're modernized?
Yeah, so how did we continue to deliver business value even when we're modernizing? That's a very interesting question. It's hard to do, but we want to make sure that we're still, so basically the way we have it, either from an agile perspective, making sure that those are accounted for, both that the business still is going to move forward, that we're accounting for those and including those in a backlog, basically. So it's more of modernization is coming, but you need to account for it in your business processes, or I'm sorry, in your business projects as well.
Yeah, and some of the key things with that as well, and that's why we're very prescriptive, is that lift and shift doesn't quite work, right? Because you have to stop the train at that point. And we need to continue to deliver value for our clients. So the way we address it is to really figure out what are the slivers throughout the system, right? Using the plays to then figure out how do I move a particular piece. And then it comes down to the backlog, you know, how the teams are working, but also being deliberate, like we cannot just stop or just add on to what we have. We need to continue to have the end in mind, and that's what the solutions are focused on. So in some cases, that might be a little bit of a, let me just call it price to be paid for delivering on that, but we're okay in doing that because it's keeping that end goal in mind.
Yeah, the short answer is very carefully.
Yeah. Like feeling the rocks in the river. Yeah. I think that's kind of the good analogy.
Other questions?
During the modernization journey, did you see most of the challenges being technical, or was it more like cultural or process?
So the question was the challenge only in technical, or was it everything else? Yes. Keep in mind, kind of like the comment I made earlier, you're really going from a 101 course, right, to a 401 course. And that's not just on the technology side, right? It's the processes. You know, you guys have heard of Conway's law, how organizations are organized is how you get your solutions as well. So it's really all of the above, and we bring very deliberate to also addressing all of those as part of our effort as well, because you can't take this in isolation. So great question. Thank you. All right, we have a couple more minutes left. Any other questions? You guys are a very engaging audience.
We're keeping you from happy hour. All right, with that, thank you.
One more, sorry, one more question.
So of all the applications you've modernized, how many of them do you think have gone down that kind of strangler approach that lets them keep running, you know, while you're modernizing, versus how many kind of just said, we're just going to go in and rewrite this stuff. We're just going to try to refactor it and redeploy it.
Sure.
So the question was, what apps, you know, of the apps that we're modernizing, how many are using a pattern like strangulation or others versus just pure modernization and stopping it and just pure modernization? I'd probably say the majority of them we look at are using a pattern similar to strangulation to not impact the client, just because we need to keep the wheels on the bus. We always use that analogy of we need to keep the wheels on the bus and change the engine under the hood while we're driving. And so I'd say the majority of them are actually doing that.
Yeah, it's one of the core patterns to leverage them. Great. So with that, we want to thank you guys. Check out the website. We're definitely hiring. So it'd be great to have you join us as well in this journey. And if you have any further questions, we'll be around. And one more shameless plug. We have one great other presentation on Thursday where you guys actually get to see how we do some of these things. So join us on Thursday. Thank you so much.